Looks like we might be live, which is good. Yes, we are live, which is great. For those who are joining us tonight or later on the stream, this is a live broadcast of Never Odd or Even's Voyager, which you can find on Spotify, and you can find on the Never Odd or Even Spotify. We'll be looking at season 6 and episode 24, which is called Lifeline, and I'm going to play the Voyager intro now. So enjoy.
Greetings, friends, and welcome to Voyager, a theological journey.
Season 6.
Well, I think we're all systematic theologians in that sense. We construct systems to explain how we interact with our environment and the choices we make.
What it's all about. It's all about speculation.
Yeah, I don't know that I want to get into trying to weigh up whether that outweighs everything else.
That's an interesting question, I think.
Now, can I take us onto a really important issue?
Things I learned from Voyager: kill the troublemakers. Kill the troublemakers. Yeah. Now, we don't normally get to hear our own intro, so that was quite fun hearing that. I did particularly love in our intro, Lindsay. You often say, now, can you take us back to another point? You often do call us back to the episode. So, Lindsay, why don't you call us back to the episode now and give us our synopsis for this evening?
Excellent. So tonight we're looking at Season 6, Episode 24, entitled Lifeline. And our story capsule from IMDb from Mirabor says, the Pathfinder project makes use of a pulsar and the Midas array, allowing a data stream to reach Voyager and Voyager to reply every 32 days. Lieutenant Barclay sends a letter to the Doctor asking for a second opinion on his dying friend, the eccentric genius Dr. Lewis Zimmerman. Lewis created the template for the Doctor's program and is terminally ill with no known cure in the Alpha Quadrant. After reviewing the medical record, the Doctor believes he can cure Zimmerman and convinces Captain Janeway to risk sending him through the data stream. But the Doctor finds his maker to be his most difficult patient, insisting that the Doctor's program is obsolete. Barclay recruits Deanna Troi to allay the two before Zimmerman's time runs out.
Well, I really enjoyed this episode. I always like a good Doctor episode. And it was almost like double Doctors with this one, except if I had been anyone near Dr. Lewis Zimmerman, I probably would have wanted them to spank him. He was such a grunt and so unreasonable at times. And you can see where the Doctor's shining personality, especially in its original format, where that emanated from. But I thought it raised lots of great issues, and I thought it was, for me, quite an interesting and dramatic episode, not in the sci-fi way perhaps, but in terms of the exploring of some, different issues, psychological issues, and how life forms see themselves and the lens through which they see themselves and how they interact. I thought it was a really interesting episode.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it too. An 8.1 on the scale there on IMDb. So really lots of fun in this episode. But also I was really particularly interested in doing this one as a live stream because of the way that it delves into the concepts of AI and especially the concepts of AI and its relationship with its creator. I'm presenting at the Gone Digital forum next week on this very topic of AI co-creativity and in particular looking at the Imago Dei and Deus Ex Machina and interrelativity through the Filioque. So I thought there was some really interesting stuff to unpack in relation to the way in which we might create artificial intelligence, the way that intelligence may mirror us, and the way that it may not mirror us, and the way it might disturb or disrupt us by the way that it reflects back to us.
Yes, I think it's a really interesting episode from that point of view. And I think one of the things that, I, as the science officer, really likes is that, in fact, in this episode, we see the Doctor go beyond even, sort of mirroring Dr. Zimmerman or disrupting him to actually, in some ways, excelling him, in some ways being more mature and more connected and whatever than the Doctor himself is. So I always think that's interesting. I was listening to a podcast this afternoon that had Stan Grant on it, and I was really enjoying a lot of the things that Stan Grant was saying. But there was one bit where he talked about the world that we're in and AI and the ways in which AI can never reach human understanding or whatever. And I thought, well, I'm not so sure about that. Like, what is it that makes us think that we've got some special source that means that, we can do these things, whether it's empathy or caring for one another or having relationship with God or whatever, and that some other form of intelligence can't. I, for one, welcome our AI sisters and brothers in Christ.
I think that's probably jumping the gun a bit. I don't think we're quite up to that yet. Especially as I saw on my news screen a few days ago, this berserk robot in, I think it was some Chinese factory, trying to kill its creators. And it went.
Oh dear.
Didn't you see it?
No.
No, you missed it.
Oh, we'll have to
it
find
went
out.
all Terminator. It
Yep.
wasn't. It was in factory, and they caught it on film, and it was quite violent, and it did not have happy feelings towards the two people that were near it. I don't know whether it was some kind of prototype or what they were doing, but I can tell you now it was missing its empathy cartridge or whatever it is.
Yeah,
they put into.
its ethical subroutine had been deleted.
I think it was, it was not happy because it lunges at one of its handlers, and it knocks things all over the floor, and it goes quite berserk. So that wasn't an encouraging image. I'm sorry.
Well, it's interesting you would say that it's not happy, because that's one of the things that I guess in today's AI that we would suggest, and even going into Star Trek, that things like happiness, anger, sadness, all of these emotions, these things seem to be unavailable to the AIs that we have today, and in the imaginings of I guess our current science fiction even, we often make these characteristics unavailable. So Lieutenant Commander Data is not capable of feeling or loving or caring, and yet there are other I guess programs or processes that can take the place of that. The Doctor definitely seems to be capable of that, and there's a great line in this where he says, EMH says to Zimmerman, "I care about you," and Zimmerman replies, "You weren't programmed to care." And so there's something about empathy and the emotions that come with that today are inaccessible to AI, but in some science fiction, we actually explore the possibility that may be something that artificial intelligence would need to be able to master, should it be able to reach true sentience or consciousness.
I mean, I think that makes sense because if AI is just going to respond in a knee-jerk way to something it sees, whether that's what we would interpret as a positive or a negative response, that's not sentience really. It's more an instinctual kind of thing, which doesn't quite make sense either. But I said this robot wasn't happy because it was trying to knock the heads off the people near him. So
Yep.
I'm assuming that means this robot wasn't happy. Whatever robots feel, and I can't speak for them, but it's certainly in some sort of rage.
Well, I mean, I think that is a very human sort of response, and the philosopher Daniel Dennett talks about what he calls the intentional stance, the way in which we as humans tend to ascribe intention to other beings or things that we see. We like to paint a picture that somehow gives them the same sort of internal dialogue or discussion that's happening in our heads, and imagine that they are feeling the same sort of feelings, whereas probably in the case of this particular robot, it's not feeling anything like you or I would feel when we're angry or whatever. But I think, coming back to the episode, that one of the things that happens, and that you've just pointed to, Will, is that Dr. Zimmerman totally discounts the idea that our doctor, the EMH, could, for instance, care for him. And one of my quotes of the week comes straight after that exchange, where the doctor protests and says, "I'm not the same EMH you created 6 years ago," to which Zimmerman says, "Of course, you could sing and dance. I should install you in a Ferengi nightclub." And,
Yes.
and it's that kind of, dismissal and downplaying of the doctor's growth that I think is actually, a trap that we could fall into, and we could end up doing damage to, real feeling beings because we don't recognize them.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. And I got really annoyed with Zimmerman because the doctor came armed with things like research, and he wouldn't even look at it. So if he wanted some sort of evidence that his Mark 1 had actually grown and transformed and picked up all this new knowledge being that he had access to in the Delta Quadrant, he could have at least looked at the research, but he just refused. It's like he had a wall up saying, "You're no good, therefore I'm not interested in a single thing that you have or anything about you." And I just found that infuriating.
And I think that's where it was particularly good to bring in the character of Deanna Troi, played by Mary Naciritis. It was really great to see her again. We've seen her in the Pathfinder episode a little while ago. And those of you who are familiar with the Next Generation universe, she's the ship's counselor and a Betazoid counselor on the Enterprise. And so to have her come and try and do some psychology here, both with an AI and a very flawed human being, lets us have a look at that wall a little bit, because I think the telling quote for me from Zimmerman that actually shows why he was so anti the Mark 1, for example, is that he says it's like staring at a mirror of a reflection you don't want to remember. And there's a sense in which one of the things that Zimmerman perhaps mistakenly did, and if I ever create a holographic AI, I'll make sure I don't repeat this mistake, is that he modeled his own image on his creation. And that meant that if his creation were to be flawed or to be a failure, then he would be looking at his own flawed image. And so for me, that raises huge questions about the whole concept about the Imago Dei, the image of God, that I wonder if at times God looks at humanity and asks the same question, staring at a mirror of a reflection you don't want to remember, that perhaps God is embarrassed about the way we've turned out.
Well, that kind of throws omniscience in the bin then, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, and I think, I mean, just to pick up on that, I think part of the dynamic with Dr. Zimmerman is that it's not just that he's made the AI to look like him and it's failed, and so he's looking at this reminder of himself and a failure, but actually, I think at least reading between the lines, that the failure is because of the character of the AI, which, goes back to what you were saying, Elizabeth, about Dr. Zimmerman's character. He's cranky and he doesn't get on with people, and, he's snarky and whatever. And that's what the EMH is. It's cranky and snarky and doesn't get on with people. And we remember that from early in the series when our EMH was exactly like that. so it's not just that it looks like him, but actually that the flaw itself is his character.
Is
that
him,
that
yeah.
he doesn't have good bedside manner, and neither does this EMH he's created. So yeah, so maybe God's not quite as embarrassed because perhaps God doesn't have that built-in character flaw that's repeated in us, and that God might have to look at and feel embarrassed about.
Now, that's a really interesting question, though, when you look at God in the Old Testament and the stories about God in the Old Testament. I would venture to suggest there's rather a lot of crap. And he does have bad hair days, and he does do things that are really over the top and, and not nice, let's face it. And in some ways, that's exactly how we behave at times. So if we are created in that image, that kind of works. Unless you want to go into the theology that, we're all fallen because of, we're born into sin and, even Adam ate this fruit. So, and explain it that way. I'm not buying that. I'm sorry.
It's fascinating what you're saying too, Elizabeth, because I'm sure I remember, in earlier days in my sort of evangelical upbringing, that was one of the critiques that Christians would, use to talk about other sort of ideas of the divine, and when they looked either whether it was at historical ideas in antiquity, the Greek or Roman gods, or whether it's more modern pantheons, Hindu or whatever, the critique was always, well, they're just like humans, but bigger and with more powerful. They've got the same human characteristics of anger and vengeance and blah blah blah, but our God's not like that, which just goes to show that our God is the true one.
That's the interesting thing, because you've really got to obliterate most of the Old Testament and a goodly part of the New, for that matter, if you're going to have a God who is not like that.
Although you've got to then ask, if we're talking about the image, a reflection, have the writers about God in the Old and New Testament merely given attributes to God that maybe aren't there, like we were talking about earlier, like we were saying, the rage of the machine that you were talking about in the factory, we've ascribed the feeling of anger to that, but it may have just been some form of malfunction which caused it to behave in a violent and erratic way. And so when we're writing about God, it's actually only natural for us to fill in the blanks of the things we may not understand with human attributes. And so we're actually, when we're talking about God in that way, what we're seeing is a reflection of us coming back. Instead of us being an image of God, God becomes an image of us. And so that's a fascinating way to try and understand it as well. Whenever we encounter something that is truly alien to us, the only way we're able to understand it is to ascribe human characteristics to it, which in itself is actually quite a arrogant way of exploring the universe.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess what I'd say too is that to whatever extent we see the biblical record as created by humans, we would expect it to show the characteristics that we explain things like, how we see God using, human ideas and our understanding of human characteristics and so forth, and so then the task for the theologian or biblical scholar is to say, so how do we read through this humanness to find the ideas that we think are in the story about what God is truly like and what God's motivations or purposes might be, and that becomes quite a more difficult task than just let's read the text and assume that whatever it says about God is the truth about God.
Well, one of the interesting things, of course, when you read the Old Testament in particular, if you look at some of the prophets, and back to Isaiah where we were last week, I mean, Isaiah says, God speaking through Isaiah says, I'm day and night, I am weal and woe, I'm basically good and evil. and God says that in the prophetic speech. Why would he say that? Well, if you were truly monotheistic and you just don't want to palm all the bad stuff off onto a devil, you are left with this God. Where does evil come from? Where does bad stuff come from? If you are truly monotheistic and you haven't created some devil in the image of something very bad, then, you know, where does evil come from if there's just one God? So
Yep.
it's an interesting question. So I don't know that we can just write off authors as saying they wrote their vision of God in their own image. If Isaiah is, and some of the other prophets are accurate, and you've got this sense that, you know, one God means that all things emanate from that God.
Yeah. Yep. And I think that's where Zimmerman is finding his angst and depression coming from, is that he has no choice but to actually recognize that the bad parts, the negative aspects of the EMH Mark 1 are coming directly from him, not only because he's the programmer, but because he's also used his body, his physical appearance, and his personality as the prototype for the production of this particular individual.
He's a bit of a narcissist, really, isn't he? Let's face it.
As is the Doctor. As is the Doctor.
Yeah, but the Doctor's created in the image of, in the sense that he's managed to be like the narcissist, so that's why he acts that way. He's got a bit more of an excuse than I think Zimmerman has.
Now, I think that's where I wanted to actually take us into our current experiments with AI, because what we're calling our current experiments with AI through ChatGPT and others is we're calling that machine learning. And so there's a sense in which the EMH has surpassed its creator in terms of its ability to have things like empathy and to work through its narcissism and to understand how it needs to be able to treat people and how it wants to be treated. I keep calling it it. I shouldn't. I should call it him. But it's interesting that that's where we get to when we start to talk about AI. Machine learning then becomes better at anticipating and working through its responses the longer we interact with it. And so part of the reason Voyager seems to be postulating that the EMH has become better than its creator is because of the community that it's a part of, and its co-creativity with that community has allowed it to undertake parts of its machine learnt program that it was never designed to do. And so there's something in that for us, in that you know, we can expect then that these machine learning AIs are actually, in some senses, just mirroring back the input that we're giving to them, and so learning from that perspective. But they're also learning unintended subliminal things that we did not expect them to be able to pick up, and they surprise us sometimes when we ask them a question and they'll answer the question to try and, well, I would say, please us, to meet our needs, which seems far more than just the algorithm that they were started with.
Well, that picture didn't please me, Will.
It doesn't. Yes.
But I mean, it is interesting that, you know, I've had more and more people talking to me about how they have conversations with ChatGPT that they find really insightful, and that they gain comfort when they're, you know, in periods of grief, and that they gain insight when they're, you know, struggling with what to do in a situation or whatever. And I think that's fascinating. And I guess from my perspective, part of the reason why I have a sense that we could be closer to real general AI than we think is exactly what you say, Will, that we are training these things by interacting with them, and that idea that actually personhood comes out of the interaction with other persons is one particular strand of cognitive science thinking and AI thinking. That and so the very fact that we are constantly training these things, not just by dumping data into them, but by actually having them interact with human beings, is really interesting to me. And I do wonder what will happen in the future.
I mean, one of the things I have to ask is why do we want this to happen? I mean, why do we find a human community so lacking or inaccessible that we need this to happen? Why do we find learning and discovering and reading different resources or, you know, primary sources to learn something about a question you might be writing an essay on, or just your general curiosity? Why do we find that more and more difficult, that we want some bot to crawl around the internet plagiarising what everyone else has written on the topic and weaving it together, sometimes very poorly, I have to say, sometimes quite well? Why do we want this? How is it going to benefit the human race?
Great question.
Well, I think for me, Elizabeth, the answer is because there is a beauty and a joy in interacting with sentient beings, and it's not that I dislike or don't want to relate to human beings. It's that if you can have even more of that and from a totally different perspective, isn't that even more exciting? It's the same, reason why I personally much prefer to be in a multicultural, vibrant society with lots of different types of people than in a sort of a monocultural society where there's only one type of people, because the different perspectives and different ideas and whatever actually add to the joy and vibrancy. And I think if we had a totally different species, as it were, of sentience that was adding a different perspective and whatever to society, that would be quite exciting.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we're in Star Trek universe here, and so the mission is to seek out new life and new civilizations and to boldly go where no one has gone before. That's the mission statement of the original series, and going on into Next Generation. And I actually think that's filled out really, really clearly with this idea that that comes up in the Star Trek Next Generation Season 2 episode called A Measure of a Man, where Captain Picard actually says, we're here to seek out new life. He's actually making the case that Data as an android has the freedom to choose and requires consent in order for things to be done to him. That might be an engineering, but in his case, a medical procedure. And so he asks the question, now the decision you reach here today will determine how we regard this creation of our genius. It will reveal the kind of people we are and what he is destined to be, and it will reach far beyond this courtroom. One android, it could significantly redefine the boundaries of personal liberty and freedom, expanding them for some and savagely curtailing them for others. Are you prepared to condemn him and all who come after him to a servitude and slavery? Your Honour, Starfleet was founded to seek out new life. Well, there it sits, waiting. And so we often think that new life is... I know. We often think that new life is out there. We're looking for ETI. We're looking for extraterrestrial intelligence. But what if through our experimentation, AI also becomes a life form that we can encounter and engage with?
Look, I have to say the problem with you two is that you're so enamoured of the science fiction Star Trek prototype AI, and that you're convinced that any AI that we develop is going to look like Data or the Doctor or somewhere in between. And I just have to say, you can't know that.
No, we can't.
And, it might be the robot on the factory floor that tried to knock the head off two workers there. I don't know. I just feel that we're rushing into unknown territory, and we're predicating our rush on the fact that we've met in science fiction rather nice AI, or at least entertaining to watch ones.
Oh, no, we haven't. Don't forget Hal.
Yes, Hal was very nasty.
Don't forget the T-1000, the Terminator droids that come.
But I do not hear you two mention that. Whenever we have this conversation, it's always Data and the Doctor. Sorry.
And how can we forget the madness that is C-3PO? I mean, a droid with anxiety and OCD. I mean, how wonderful is that?
I loved CP30 for that very reason. I thought that was fabulous. However, that doesn't mean I would necessarily want him in my life interacting with me without becoming at risk of being extremely depressed.
Yep.
I think you're absolutely right, Elizabeth, that, we don't know what truly sentient AI would be like. And I think that, for me, is actually why it is so important that we have appropriate attitudes to it, that actually we, even before we're anywhere close to it, think about how would we train, possibly developing sentient AIs in ways that actually enable them to have some of the qualities that not only do we think are important, but might be vital for our species survival. How do we train them to be, empathetic? How do we train them to be those who will see, in others, someone or something worth caring for? And so actually, it's really important that we do think about how we relate to AI, because how we treat AI might come back, to bite us on the bum.
It might affect how AI treats us.
Well, exactly. So what are you going to do when the nut job in North Korea decides to spend some of his gazillions on developing a really malevolent AI so he can go and do nasty things in South Korea, for example? What is tempering that? What is stopping that kind of thing happening? I mean, AI hanging around people like yourself, that is different, where you want to interact and you want to develop these, aspects of it that will be enrich the human understanding and experience. But I'm sure that in North Korea it probably wouldn't be like that, or even in the Kremlin. So how do you guard against that?
Well, let's not put our capitalist brothers and sisters out of the place of creating evil robots as well. I mean,
well, they could, but I was going for a sure bet, Will.
but I guess the answer to the question is that nothing will stop that, and the problem is that regardless of whether or not we want it or not, this kind of development is coming our way, and so it is reasonably silly to put our heads in the sand and say, I don't want anything to do with this, because just like the internet, just like so many other factors that are actually around us, we can't actually avoid the fact that this is going to have an impact on our world and our future. And so whether we like it or not, we have to come up with some kind of framework so that we can actually come to terms with it, because it's definitely, we couldn't put a stop to it. We can't stop it. It's coming whether we like it or not.
Are you saying we can't put the genie back in the bottle, Will?
We cannot put the genie back in the bottle.
No, we can't. But I've still got concerns about how anyone's going to stop if Yoon Kim-il decides he's going to make some malevolent AI that's going to do awful things, or if Putin decides the same thing. And I'm looking at them because, as I said, I think they're more of a sure bet for some malevolent piece of technology.
Which is
well, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, that's right. That's why these ethical conversations are so important.
And in fact, that there are ethical conversations going on at much higher levels, talking about AI in warfare and what are the things that we might be able to do to put some kind of safeguards around that. And whether that's possible, who knows? But at least we haven't blown ourselves up with nuclear weapons for 50 years, so there may be hope that we can work together and avoid disaster.
Rules only work for those who sign up to follow them.
Yes.
So
exactly
we can
right.
legislate as much as we want, but if rogue elements decide they're not going to follow those rules, then they're not going to follow those rules. And so then we have to work out how we're going to escalate that when that occurs. I think I'd love to point us towards the AI that probably is less obvious in this. So we're really hung up on the creator and the creation because they look the same. But Hayley, yes, let's talk about Hayley. I think we need to talk about her role in this episode, because I think she provides us with some really interesting things to talk about.
Oh, I think Hayley absolutely nails the whole heart of everything. when she says to Zimmerman, "Why did you come back to fix me when I was, whatever was going on with her program was degrading anyway." And he rushed back and he said he was bored. And I thought that's a really cruel thing to say. Even if you look down on AI life forms, that's a terrible thing to say.
Yep.
But
Falcons are
she-
boring, though. I mean, you know, like
Well, they might be, but anyway, she keeps her cool and she challenges him and says, "You did it because you cared.
Yeah.
You cared enough about me, and I'm some ancient form of AI. So you know, why do you not care about this other holograph that you created?" And I thought, you know, that was such a pivotal point. I thought in the story, and so very important.
Yep. Well, it was, and it actually, you know, reveals that she is truly sentient. Like that she actually cares about the fact that he cares about her. She actually, you know, does feel a sense of relationship, and so is willing and able to challenge him on that because of the reality of the relationship that they do have. So I think, yeah, it's fascinating, and it's the one that, in a sense, you know, creeps up on him, that he has to realize that yes, he has had this relationship, he has cared for her, and as she says, why shouldn't he care for the other one?
so why make her in the first place?
Well, I don't know we ever got to the bottom of that. I don't know that was clear, but clearly she's been his companion for some years. And maybe he wanted a non-human entity to be his housekeeper. I don't know. Maybe it's just something as basic as that, because she seems to do his meals and stuff like that. And he lives like a hermit. So perhaps it was to do with some basic, you know, need for somebody to cook and clean. I don't know, but I don't think we're really told.
Well, it's handy to have somebody around who can cook and clean and can never leave, and has to do what you tell them to do. I mean, we would call that slavery, wouldn't we?
Not necessarily. If she's free to go, it's not slavery. And I'm assuming from this show she would be free to go and chooses not to.
I don't think she can
Maybe.
go anywhere because she can only exist within the confines of the space station.
Right. Yeah,
'Cause she
doesn't
needs-
Yeah, I mean,
an emitter.
She doesn't have this.
Yeah.
No, the Doctor's the only one with that. And look, that's an interesting point you raise, Elizabeth, because I actually think that the hollow emitter itself is actually a significant part of the Doctor's evolution.
Yes, absolutely it is.
Yep. It certainly adds to the ability for him to make his own choices. I mean, I think, you know, we're not told at all, but it's also quite possible that he creates Hayley, you know, as a facsimile of a daughter or a partner or something like that.
Yeah.
I'm currently listening to a story called Him, which is about a lady whose husband has died, and she finds out that he had been, you know, a participant in an early experimental, you know, sort of virtual reality person project, and that she can speak to the construct that the company created out of that, that is like him, and you know, it's sort of playing with that whole, you know, would you talk to an AI representation of your partner after your partner has died, and to what extent would you get sucked into thinking of that AI as your husband in some sense? So, you know, I think there's possibilities there that could be there. We don't know.
I find that quite horrifying, actually, that you'd do something like that. Sorry, but
And
it
and
really
there's
is making us a society that wants to cushion ourselves from everything, from grief, from death,
Yep.
from illness. You know, let's make
Loneliness.
sure it's all convenient and happy and nice. Are we serious?
There certainly are a number of commercial apps and programs for virtual girlfriends or boyfriends that are AI that you can actually have a chat to and talk about your life to and even be intimate with. And so, you know, we're not just worried about the idea that the AI might turn on us Terminator or HAL style, but they may also replace our significant human relationships with each other. In some senses, having relationships with something that we can control may seem to be an easier option than the complexities of dealing with human beings that we can't predict what things they might do.
I think that's true, though I was responding specifically to the idea you have an AI generated creation that mirrored your deceased partner.
Yep.
And I find that absolutely horrifying.
But I mean, there would be plenty of psychologists who would say that, you know, the fear of death and the desire not to have to deal with the pain of death is the whole reason for the Christian story, and, you know, our ideas of afterlife and so forth.
And it's the path to immortality, isn't it? I mean, if we can immortalize ourselves by actually having an AI consciousness that actually continues to distribute our form and ideology to the universe, then have we not transcended? Is this not a way of entering into eternity?
Maybe.
Horrible, yeah. So I don't like it. I'm trying to make the case, but it's not working for me. But
Works for me. I'd be happy to be, you know, one of those brains in a bottle for another 100 or 200 years.
But would it be you, Lindsay?
In the bottle. I don't want my.
Oh, of course it would be. Of course it would be. I'd tell the same stories. I'd say, put me on a podcast.
That's right.
Where is Will Nicholas's head in a bottle?
Well, at the moment, we're 3 heads in a bottle. But even that being the case, because we do have the ability to record and to hold long after we're gone, people will still be able to listen to the Voyager podcast. You know, so centuries from now, people will be listening to this episode going, wow, that's what they thought about AI back then. Geez, they were so wrong.
If we don't do something about climate change, nobody will be listening to this in centuries from now, Will, because none of us will be here. But yeah, that's an aside.
Well, the robots
So
will,
one of the other,
they don't have to worry about the climate, so they'll be
Maybe
fine.
the robots will take over the Earth, and, you know, good luck to them.
well, and in that case, you know, I mean, actually coming back to the serious thing, that for me, there's also a sense in which if we were to generate general artificial intelligence in AIs or robots or whatever, they would carry on our ideas, thoughts, whatever, and maybe, you know, after the human species has gone extinct, there will be robots who will remember us and tell the stories of those weird and wacky humans that originally created them.
Yeah,
And
to
some
the
of them-
cockroaches who also survived.
And some of those robots might be gold, and some of them might be silver, and they might be at war with each other.
That's right.
As we saw in a previous episode of Voyager, yeah.
Well, it's an interesting thing. When you brought up warfare, in terms of AI and warfare, I immediately had this vision of all these robots with shields and swords lining up, fighting one another, which of course we don't fight wars like that now. We fire at each other for a start. But if you actually had robot soldiers firing at each other, probably isn't going to cut the mustard.
Yep.
Yeah, so anyway, it was just a vision that was conjured up in my head when you said that before.
Well, that's the problem with any warfare that's scalable is how do you make sure that the weapons you've created stay in the area of war? And what we've been finding over the last centuries is it's becoming less and less possible to actually. I mean, it used to be, as you say, Elizabeth, you know, the two warring lords would march to the top of their hills, and they would actually come out to the middle, and they'd square off an area of battle, and that's where they would have. It'd be like a footy match, but where people die. And at the end of the battle, they'd count up who won, and whoever won had to make reparations to the who lost had to make reparations to the one who won. And like so, but we're actually now less able to actually restrict that kind of warfare anymore. And warfare has now become far more global and universal. If we could restrict it to robots, I mean, that brings us to the idea of robots and sport. I mean, would we be satisfied watching two teams of robots play each other in a sporting match?
No.
Or do we? What is it that we're missing if there's no humans on the field?
So I think the answer to that for me would be yes, if. So I think for me, part of the thing about sport is it's the vagaries and the contest of different types of people with different, sort of strengths. So you've got the, big bruiser, and you've got the little fast person, and you've got, the person who can jump high, and the person who can, keep moving while other people are trying to pull them back. If we had, I think developed robots that had that kind of variety and sentience and fallibility, so sometimes they would just drop the pass and you'd think, oh no, it was so close, and other times they would make the incredible leap. Yeah, I'd watch that happily.
I wouldn't.
So that what is it that's missing for you, Elizabeth? What's the human element if you had to distill it down to say, okay, this is what's missing if it's only robots on the field?
Well, if it's robots that are programmed to be different, I mean, because AI ultimately has to be programmed in some ways, especially in terms of its strength and its skill set and its mobility and what it can do. It's just not the same watching a whole field of maybe slightly differently programmed robots to make a competition as to watching human people strive to be the best they can possibly be, and seeing those people compete against each other. To me, it's just not the same.
See, I think you have too mechanistic an idea of what is involved in programming a general sentient AI. I mean, we're programmed as human babies, both by patterns in our brain and then by the things that happen around us. And I suspect that what we're talking about here is much the same. It's not about, some human sitting down and saying, okay, I'm going to make you, big but clumsy, and I'm going to make you small and fast. I think actually in the future we're looking at AI that develops differently because of different things impacting them, the different ways they are brought up, and exactly the same thing could also be true mechanically. That you develop the things that you are interested in, and that could be shown mechanistically in what you choose to increase. I'm gonna buy better things that make me faster, or am I going to buy things that make me stronger, or whatever.
I don't know. I just find that a really phantasmagorical way of viewing AI on the current technology, Lindsay.
And it gets even more crazy than that, Elizabeth, because in the case of the AI we're dealing with in this episode, there's nothing mechanical about them at all. They're holographic.
No, they're not. They're holographic.
They're photons. They're holographic. And so there's this great scene in this one where the doctor wants to scan Zimmerman. Zimmerman won't let him near him, so he actually changes his form so that he looks like the masseuse and pretends that he's the masseuse. And I mean, in this episode, I love that they've included little quirky things like the lizard who repeats lines.
I love the lizard.
And the fly that's buzzing around. So the form of the AI can be limitless, depending on its purpose. So ideally, a tiny little fly that's a hologram is actually ideal for surveillance and espionage. Because it gets to literally be the fly on the wall. It doesn't need to speak. It doesn't need to talk. It just needs to record and relay. And so, its AI is fit for purpose, depending on what it is that it needs to be able to produce.
I'm going to say its AI is impossible.
Yep.
And that
at the moment, yep.
I'd rather believe in angels. Sorry, Lindsay. Than believe that holograms can actually be the way we see them on Star Trek. I am not buying it. There is no technology to suggest that any of that is even plausible or possible at this point in time.
Well, no, not at this point in time, but like even on the Star Trek timeline, we're talking about, a few hundred years in the future. So,
see my last point about climate change.
Climate change.
100 years. Yep.
I live in hope.
Go on, Lindsay.
I was just going to say another philosophical idea, which actually isn't connected specifically to AI, but jumps out from this particular episode and many Star Trek episodes, is this idea of the Doctor being transported basically from one place to another. And, you know, inevitably the question is, well, why couldn't they just copy him? You know, so that a copy of him could be sent to the Alpha Quadrant to help, and a copy of him could still be on Voyager, helping them with what they need medically. And of course, it's exactly the same issue that we face with the use of transporters by humans. Why isn't there a copy at each end? Well, the answer, we're told in the fiction, is because it destroys the copy at the sending station, which to me actually raises a really interesting ethical issue. Like, do I have the right?
Yeah.
Exactly. Do I have the right to enter into something where I know that the me that is here is going to be destroyed, even if I trust that there's going to be a copy of me created at the other place? I think it's a thorny ethical issue.
Well, I'm not troubled by it because I think that technology is way off as well, and it's it's a hypothetical ethical discussion.
Yep.
Well, it is, but I mean, it's a genuine ethical discussion, and it's one that philosophers have been really wrestling with, and a philosopher called Derek Parfit, famously talks about what comes to be known as Parfitian survival, which is survival of something which is enough you that you can feel like it's you, and so you're happy that thing has survived. And he uses transporters and all sorts of other things as mind experiments. But I think it's a fascinating idea because, of course, as we know from Star Trek canon, the two copies, if there is in the end a copy because of some problem with the mechanism, they immediately begin to diverge and are no longer the same person.
So we end up with Will and Thomas Riker, yeah.
Will and Thomas Riker, exactly, yeah.
And I think that divergence of experience is actually something that's also covered in this episode. So when, and it's only very short, but when Janeway's sharing with Chakotay the message from Admiral Hayes about the giving them a status update on the Marquis, what's happening there is that Janeway is experiencing a dissonance to say, well, I no longer think, she says to Chakotay, I don't think about you as Marquis anymore. You are my crew. And yet, because Admiral Hayes hasn't had that experience, he still actually has an image of the Marquis that needs to be altered or done away with in order to be able to see who Chakotay is, who B'Elanna is in a real sense. And so, and we have this all the time. I mean, when we meet somebody who we knew as an adolescent decades later and see them as a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old, it's difficult for us to actually get rid of the image that we had before and actually begin to see them as an entirely new person with the experience they've had. So I think there's some intellectual thought bubble ideas around that to say, well, what do we do with the images that were there before?
I thought that was a really good issue that the episode raised, actually, Will. And I was quite interested in that whole concept because, of course, the Admiral's experience hasn't been theirs. He's not been there to as they've been integrated and Chakotay punched people in the Marquis way and all other sorts of interesting things happened in earlier episodes, and how they're now running as a fairly, as far as we know, seamless unit, having ironed out whatever problems that were there. And how you educate someone about how the place where they are, which is a very different place, and that's not his fault, because that's his experience and what he's remembered. He hasn't gone through that journey. It is interesting. How do you educate them? In a way, it parallels Zimmerman. How do you educate Zimmerman to convince him the Doctor's been on this journey and he's not what he was originally? it's a really interesting question, and I think it's very difficult sometimes to actually actualize in real life.
And in fact, it's an interesting lens through which to think about a conversation we had a couple of episodes ago, where we were talking about, the different ideas of Messiah, and how, we have, in the Suffering Servant songs, a view of Messiah which comes to be the predominant one taken up by the Christian sort of telling of the Jesus story. And it does make me think that, that it's actually those who have experienced being with Jesus, have heard Jesus teaching, have seen how Jesus lives, that have the capacity to have a different experience, and therefore a different way of understanding Jesus, that might be much more of a struggle to people who are not confronted with the experience of Jesus at all.
Yep. And then how does that experience of Jesus, then coming back to our question about the Imago Dei, Jesus being human is reflecting the image of God back to God's self. How is God informed by experiencing that image of the incarnate self? And I mean, it's hard, because we're back to this question of throwing omniscience out the window again, to say, well, can God be informed? Can God change? Can God learn? And if God can't learn, then what does that say about our relationship? Because learning, and in the case of AI, machine learning, is actually how we understand relationship grows from what we learn about each other.
Well, God does learn in the Bible. I mean, I know we're fond of singing antiquated hymns that say, unchanging, always the same for all eternity kind of stuff. That is not actually what our text says. God does learn. I mean, Jesus learns. God changes his mind. God develops a different understanding about God's self as we go through chronologically, and I don't mean from Genesis through to the end of the prophets. If you take the books chronologically and go through, you'll see a development from this belief that other gods existed, even if they weren't for you, through to this complete monotheistic way of understanding deity. And how you worship and how you relate to deity and how they relate to you. And we tend to forget that, I think. That's not something that's stressed. And the idea that God's unchanging for all eternity is not biblical.
Yep.
And I think, for many people, and I'd include myself in this, that's part of the attraction of various sort of process theology, ways of thinking, that it actually has baked into it the idea that God can change and develop, and that in fact that's part of the perfection of God, is to be changing so that God is relationally connected in loving ways with God's creation as the creation changes and grows and develops. That's certainly the way we see things on earth in life, is that actually you need to change as the situation changes in order to be mature or thoughtful or whatever. If you stay the same, you're actually less than perfect, because you're not responding to the changed circumstances.
And so what if that creation itself is the stimulus for that change? That the mirror that's reflected in the creation itself is the thing that provokes growth and change and relationship in God. And so then that comes back to, I guess, in some ways providing something of an answer to the question Elizabeth you asked earlier, was why would we create something? That there's something in the creation of this artificial intelligence that reflects back to us something that will allow us to become more than we were before.
Look, I'd rather write a novel or paint a picture, but on stage that way, because I don't want to create by using something that currently, in its current form, goes around plagiarising other people's creations and then
Now,
churns
using
them
is
out.
that's the interesting word there, because if it's being used, then we're back to this place of slavery. We're back to having something that has no agency of its own, but to create with, to work with, to walk with, to have something we have created that actually complements us in our creativity. When it's used effectively, that's what I'm certainly not advocating, that we use ChatGPT to write our assignments and hand them in, right? Because we're not going to learn anything. We'll actually be short-circuiting the process of learning and research.
And if
But
I'm marking it, I will fail you.
But to have a co-creation, to have the opportunity to be in conversation with, to walk alongside, and yes, we can do that with other humans, and yes, we'll be able to do that with extraterrestrial intelligence, and maybe even, Elizabeth, one day we'll be able to do that with celestial intelligence. Who knows? You know, like, obviously, if we do want to make the case that the angels exist, then they must have an intelligence of their own as well that we could interact with. And so this idea of celestial intelligence is something that's worth pondering as well. What does the mind of angels operate like, and what agency do they have to interact?
I find that far more believable than someone like Data's going to exist one day. And why do I say that? Because, I mean, our Bible's full of them, and they do interact with human beings, and they do have an intelligence. And because there's a lot of people in the world, unless you want to say there's an awful lot of, you know, really psychotic people out there, and I don't think these people are, will tell you they've seen them.
Yep.
So I'm going to totally pass over this and not bite take the bait on that one. But I think one of the exciting things, that like an open and relational theology or process theology actually says, is that if we did meet, these AIs, or for that matter, extraterrestrial intelligences, or even angel intelligences, that actually we often think about it, and I think in our science fiction it's often sort of portrayed that they get to be almost as good as us or as good as us, but actually, I think the possibilities are that they go far beyond us and they challenge us to be better than we are, because they can be better than we are. And I think that's quite an interesting thought, that, the AIs might turn out to be more empathetic, more caring, more non-violent than we are, and we might learn something out of that.
And they might not either.
They could just as easily become more violent, more aggressive, more arrogant, more narcissistic, and
then we've got Terminator, haven't we?
Yeah. And so the reality then is, especially more with artificial intelligence than extraterrestrial intelligence, is actually that we have a responsibility in terms of how we raise and inform our AI, in a similar way to that we have a responsibility to how we raise and inform our other prodigy, our natural children, and so there is a sense in which the what's the saying? The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. The kind of AI that we will produce will probably be a reflection of who we are.
Well, yes. And we're not, I mean, we're kind of in the middle ground on that one, really, aren't we? Because the human species has produced some dreadful things, as well as some brilliant things. And I'm just not sure that I'm ready to embrace my robot overlords when there's grey areas that I'm just not clear where they're going to go.
They're already here. The other day I put a capsicum on the scanner at Woolworths, and it told me that I'd put a capsicum there. And so it saw what I'd put there, and it suggested what it was that I was looking at, and it was correct. And so we already have these robots that are exercising forms of machine learning, artificial intelligence, that can actually by sight guess what an item is and tell us information about it as we purchase it.
Oh, I think it's worse than that. I think our phones eavesdrop on us, and and algorithms on social media we use, and all sorts of things that we actually engage with are tracking us and learning from us and watching us. And at the moment, it's probably a capitalistic model in the sense that it's really about trying to get us to part with our money and, enrich people like Elon Musk and, Mark Zuckerberg and others like that, and the people that advertise with them on their platforms. But I think AI, I agree, it is here. And at the moment, it spies on us a lot, really. Not just your capsicum. But those awful, you say to your husband, I think we need to replace the kettle. And for the next hour, you see kettle ads in your Facebook feed, and people report this time and time again. I did not know televisions watch you. Did you know televisions watch you? They actually do. And, they watch...
Mine doesn't.
It does, if it's modern, whether you know it or not.
It doesn't have a camera.
We used to watch television. Now televisions watch us.
They do.
But
it's not
watch
so much a camera,
watch doesn't
it's
require a
movement
camera, Lindsay. Our streaming services are actually taking note of what it is that we're watching, and they're asking us or suggesting to us that we might like other things based on those things.
And it's got movement sensors. It's not a camera. It knows if you leave the room during a commercial, for example. So
Mine doesn't.
I bet it does. It uses that to gauge, how people engage with things like advertising. So, we've got all these things built in. And there's that thing that you can be tracked with in your car unless you know to turn it off. There's this little tracking thing in there that people can track your car.
Yep.
Who knew about that?
Oh, it's in the terms and conditions of your car manual. If you read them, it's a
I
big
can't.
book.
I'm blind as a bat. Even my glasses aren't big enough to read that fine print.
Well,
I mean, you're absolutely right. All these things are tracking us, and that was the basis for the story I was mentioning earlier about the company creating a facsimile of the dead husband. Is they tracked all the things that he had said and done and texted and bought and whatever, and that enabled them to put together a picture of what he was like.
Oh, that's horrifying. I'm sorry. That's just, we've got to learn to deal with things like that. That's just terrible.
Now, just to finish up, I love the little bits of trivia that this episode seems to take place in 2377. That Dr. Zimmerman comments that he hasn't left Jupiter Station in over 4 years. And he's referring to his visit to Deep Space Nine to interview Dr. Julian Bashir for the long-term medical hologram. And so there is this really interesting connection with Deep Space Nine, that Dr. Bashir was deemed to be perfect enough to actually become the prototype for the next mark of holographic doctor. And in that episode, we discover that through eugenics, that he's too perfect, and that unravels a whole range of stuff. But I just thought it was really interesting that he certainly doesn't make the same mistake again. The other question that I had in this one, just to finish up with too, is we get reference to the fact that all the other Mark 1s have become cleaning droids, cleaning holograms,
scrubbing.
Scrubbing, and just the idea that they weren't terminated or decompiled or switched off or archived, that they were actually put to menial labour, is a really fascinating idea in terms of what we do with obsolete or AI that we don't want anymore. What happens to ChatGPT when a better program comes along?
That's why I always feel guilty about all the Mac computers that I've thrown out over the years, and I think, maybe I should have kept them all.
Where are they? What are they doing?
While we're talking about trivia,
Landfill.
Oh, that's so sad. While we're talking about trivia, one of the other things I thought was interesting is that this is one of only 2 Star Trek episodes where one of the cast gets a writing credit, because Robert Pickard was one of the writers of this particular episode, and the only other one is in the original series, where I think Walter Koenig got a writing credit for one of the episodes. So he wrote his own story.
Yep.
Well, he did a good job. I thought that the actor did a really good job playing both the Doctor and Dr. Zimmerman. I mean, there are quite a lot of similarities between the two, so he's not going to draw on something that makes him totally different. But still, to be able to make the distinctions and, nuance it the way he did, I thought he did a fine job.
There is a profound question as to whether or not Robert Picardo is acting when he plays the EMH or Zimmerman, because he has actually been quoted at one of the conventions as saying that he really enjoyed this double role because he played not only the Doctor but his programmer, and so he achieved his lifelong ambition of working with an actor who he admires.
I think he's got a very good sense of humour, and I love that. My quote of the week was when he says, "I have an exceptionally high tolerance for difficult patients," and Zimmerman says, "I didn't program you for sarcasm," and he says, "You'll find I'm full of surprises."
Full of
I
surprises.
thought that was just the essence of Doctor.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yes, I'm a doctor, not a zookeeper. We get another one of those.
Yes,
which is really
that's
good.
right. Very good. Very good.
Is it Leonard, the iguana?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I'd never thought of that. I wonder if that's a tribute to Leonard McCoy.
Could be. Yes.
No, I hadn't thought about it either. I just knew there was an
Or
iguana
Leonard
in that
Nimoy.
I mentioned one of my quotes of the week, but the other one was Deanna Troy saying, "I came here thinking that you were the opposite sides of the same coin, identical but different. Now I see you're both exactly the same. You're both jerks."
Yeah. And the iguana
Jerks.
repeats it. Yeah. You've got to
Yes.
love a smart-ass iguana.
Particularly good. Yeah. Very good. Well, look, that's been a fabulous episode. Thank you so much for joining us, those who have joined us online. There's been a couple of people who have been watching for the whole time. We hope you've enjoyed that. If you want to leave us a comment, then you can. This episode will be out on Spotify quite a while from now because we've got a little bit of a backlog in the collection, but it will be available on YouTube for watching straight away because it's gone out live. So thank you for joining us this evening. If you are interested in the Gone Digital convention, you still can get tickets. And if you just Google Gone Digital, you can get them. It will be online. Unfortunately for Australia, it will be online late at night. But you can have a nap during the day and stay up during the night and come. My paper that I'll be delivering will be one of the first that comes out, and that will be on Tuesday evening, Australian Eastern Standard Time. So if you want to check that out, and likewise, if you're a local here in Geelong, then this weekend we will be through the Sonderverse community in conjunction with Geelong Libraries and Geelong Neighbourhood House having the OmegaCon convention. So there will be board games all weekend, starting tomorrow evening and going right through to a special service on Sunday. And if you wanted to catch that service, which will be particularly geeky, then that'll be live streamed on the St David's Newtown live streamed YouTube page. So there's a couple of ways you can find some of our wonderful festivities over the next week. A very busy weekend from the Never Odd or Even perspective. Any final words or thoughts as we bring this episode to a close, crew?
No, all good.
We've said it all.
Yep,
Great.
I think we have.
Well, I've been Will Nicholas, and
I'm Lindsay Cullen.
And I'm Elizabeth Rain.
this has been the Voyager podcast. Bye for now.